April 25th, 1988. Copperas Cove, Texas. After an argument with her boyfriend, 20-year-old college student Elizabeth Campbell storms out of his house and hitches a ride to a convenience store. After phoning her boyfriend and making an unsuccessful attempt to convince him to pick her up, Elizabeth vanishes without a trace. Over the next few weeks, there would be multiple sightings of Elizabeth in the company of a possessive man, leading to speculation that she was abducted and forced into prostitution. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Minisode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be covering another case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1988 disappearance of Elizabeth Campbell. This mystery was suggested a while back by a listener named Fred, so thank you Fred. I thought it would be a good time to cover it since the segment was recently uploaded to Amazon Prime, and it's kind of an overlooked case from the show. Like many unsolved disappearances, there were unconfirmed eyewitness sightings of the victim after she vanished. Most of the time, eyewitnesses are mistaken about who they saw, but there's something about these sightings which seem to open up the possibility that Elizabeth was abducted, kept alive by her captor, and possibly forced into sex slavery. I previously featured this case in an article I wrote for listverse.com titled 10 Missing Persons Cases with Strange Sightings, which was originally published in February of 2016. But before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and shorter minisodes like this one. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, so if you're new to this podcast and you like it, be sure to subscribe to it. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who feels like making a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. We also have a bunch of new donors this week, including Elliot, who has signed up for recurring monthly donations, donors named Kyra and Purity, and a donation from the Berwick Daguerrean Gallery. So thank you very much to everyone for their generosity. And in case you missed my announcement last week, I'm going to be appearing at CrimeCon this year at the JW Marriott Hotel in Indianapolis from June 9th to the 11th. The Trail Went Cold is going to be represented on Podcast Row alongside the best true crime podcasters in the business. So if any of you listeners are attending, feel free to come say hi, because I'd love to meet you in person. But if you're planning to attend but haven't bought passes yet, we have a promo code you can use to receive a 20% discount. Just visit crimecon.com and receive your discount by entering TTWC20. That's TTWC20. Hope to see you there. Oh, and I also wanted to take a brief moment to give shoutouts to some true crime blogs that have given favorable plugs to The Trail Went Cold during the past month. There's deeptalkradio.com, where Aurelia Frau wrote an article about the return of Unsolved Mysteries to Amazon Prime and mentioned The Trail Went Cold. There's truecrimeguy.com, in which Mike Morford talked about The Trail Went Cold in an article about true crime podcasts. And truenoirstories.wordpress.com, in which the anonymous author listed The Trail Went Cold in an excellent article about true crime podcasts and referred to yours truly as the friendliest sounding man on earth. So thank you very much, folks, for your support and for helping put our podcast name out there. So with all that business out of the way, let us now examine the unsolved disappearance of Elizabeth Campbell. Our story begins in Texas in 1988. Our central figure is 20-year-old Elizabeth Campbell, who lives with her parents in the town of Lampasas. Elizabeth is the biracial child of an American father, Tom Campbell, and a Korean mother, Sam Soon Campbell. She is currently a student at Central Texas College with plans to attend Texas A&M in the fall, and she works part-time at a 7-Eleven convenience store in Killeen. On the evening of April 25th, Elizabeth finished her classes at the college and went to work her shift at the 7-Eleven before heading over to the home of her boyfriend, Ricky Ray, for a group study session to prepare for final exams. At some point, the couple got into a fight, and Elizabeth demanded that Ricky take her home since her parents' house was located around 30 miles away. Ricky refused, but Elizabeth soon decided to storm out of his house without telling him. Approximately 45 minutes later, shortly after 11 p.m., Ricky received a call from Elizabeth, who said she was calling from a phone at a 7-Eleven off Highway 190 in the town of Copperas Cove, located over 10 miles away. Elizabeth had apparently gotten a ride there, but she was still 17 miles away from her parents' house, so she asked Ricky to come pick her up. However, Ricky was still angry about their previous argument and refused to go get her, so Elizabeth said she would find another ride, and angrily hung up. And unfortunately, this would turn out to be the last time anyone ever spoke to her. Elizabeth never returned home, and when her parents woke up the following morning, they realized she wasn't there. Unfortunately, since Elizabeth was technically an adult, the police said she had to be missing for at least 72 hours before they'd file a report, so Tom and Sam Soon Campbell would be forced to do their own investigative work for the next few days. The Campbells went to the 7-Eleven in Copperas Cove and spoke to the employees, who remembered seeing Elizabeth get dropped off by a man in a light green Gremlin. Elizabeth came in to use the phone, and the staff let her do so since they recognized Elizabeth from the 7-Eleven where she worked. Elizabeth phoned her boyfriend, who of course refused to come pick her up. She then made an attempt to call her parents, and Sam soon did remember briefly being awoken by the sound of a ringing phone that night, but it stopped before she could get up to answer it. Elizabeth then apparently said she would try to call her brother, but since it would have been a long-distance call, and she didn't want to use the store's phone for that, she decided to go outside to use the payphone. One witness would later confirm seeing her on the payphone, but no one knows what happened to her after that. So Tom and Sam soon decided to go searching for the green Gremlin which dropped Elizabeth off, since it was a very distinct vehicle. And believe it or not, they actually found it in a campus parking lot at Central Texas College. They waited around until the owner, who happened to be a student there, showed up, and he would confirm that he gave Elizabeth a ride the night before. He claimed that he left the college that night and saw Elizabeth walking down Highway 190, so he offered her a lift. However, the driver was only going as far as Copperas Cove, and he could not take her all the way to Lampasas, so he dropped Elizabeth off at the 7-Eleven. Even after the Campbells were finally able to report Elizabeth missing with the police, they did not stop their legwork and spent the next several weeks distributing thousands of missing persons flyers throughout Texas. Well, at one point, Sam soon traveled to a gas station near Waco, 85 miles from where Elizabeth was last seen, and when she showed the convenience store clerk a missing persons flyer, he actually recognized Elizabeth from her photo. The clerk remembered seeing a young woman matching Elizabeth's description 6 days after she was reported missing. The woman was accompanied by an unidentified Asian man who looked like he was pretty possessive of her. The man spoke harshly to his female companion in a language the clerk did not understand, and she pretty much kept her head down the entire time she was in the store. The man had a strong grip on the woman's arm and did not let go of her, even when he was paying for his transaction. When the woman briefly looked up at the clerk, her male companion briskly dragged her out of the store. Well, it wasn't long before a clerk at another convenience store thought she recognized Elizabeth from her missing persons flyer. She described a strikingly similar incident which took place 2 weeks after Elizabeth's disappearance. Only this time, the sighting took place in Copperas Cove, only 2 miles away from Elizabeth's last known location. Once again, this clerk described seeing a young woman matching Elizabeth's description in the company of an Asian male, who held onto her wrist the entire time they were there and seemed very possessive of her. The couple purchased some ice cream, but the woman kept her head down the entire time and did not speak even after the clerk spoke to her. The clerk got the impression that she was not with her male companion by choice. There would be one more reported sighting of Elizabeth which took place on July 10th. This time, it was at a gas station in Garland, located over 150 miles away from Copperas Cove. A witness bumped into a frightened-looking woman who resembled Elizabeth as she was exiting the convenience store before she headed towards a nearby parked car. Now, apparently, the police were skeptical that the woman at any of these reported locations was Elizabeth, but her parents became fearful that she might have been abducted, held against her will, and possibly forced into prostitution or sex trafficking by her unidentified male companion. The case stalled for a couple of years until there was a very strange and unexpected development in June of 1992. The Crockett County Sheriff's Department in the town of Ozona discovered that they had Elizabeth's purse in their property room. It contained some of her identification, including her social security card and credit card, but her makeup, hairbrush, and keys were missing. But the really weird part is that no one knows how the purse got there. Ozona is located over 200 miles west from where Elizabeth was last seen. Presumably, someone found the purse in the area and turned it into the sheriff's department, but it doesn't look like they had any record of when exactly it was found or who turned it in. And of course, when they ran this update on Unsolved Mysteries, they somehow managed to make a photograph of a purse look as creepy as hell when they showed it with eerie music and Robert Stack's narration playing in the background. Don't ask me why, but I always found that photo to be strangely unnerving. But sadly, this lead didn't go anywhere, and there haven't really been any major developments in this case for years. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, this is a very sad case, since Elizabeth's disappearance might have been preventable if her boyfriend hadn't been such a jerk and just given her a ride or picked her up from the convenience store. But I'm sure he beats himself up for that decision a lot. And it sounds like her mother was just seconds away from answering the phone when Elizabeth called her for a ride. I cannot be certain if Elizabeth was able to make an attempt to contact her brother from the payphone outside the 7-Eleven, but it seems apparent that something happened to her shortly after she left the store. I wish I had more information about the college student who picked up Elizabeth in the Green Gremlin and dropped her off at the 7-Eleven. It sounds like Elizabeth's parents spoke to him before the police did, but I'd like to think that he was formally questioned at some point and cleared as a suspect. Elizabeth's mother apparently described her as a naive, trusting girl, so it is possible she could have accepted a ride from the wrong person outside the convenience store. It seems pretty likely that Elizabeth was taken against her will at some point that night, but the big question is, was she a victim of foul play, or was she actually kept alive and forced into prostitution? Well, whenever a young woman goes missing these days, and there is no direct evidence of foul play, there will often be speculation about her becoming a victim of sex trafficking. The Unsolved Mystery segment contained an interview with Lois Lee, the founder of Children of the Night, which for the past 4 decades has been the premier organization for rescuing young victims from prostitution and sex trafficking. During her interview, Lee goes into detail about how these victims are often repeatedly abused by their captors until their identity is stripped away and they are supplied with a new one. This process allows the victim's captor to have total control over them at all times when they force them into prostitution. While no one wants to believe that their child was abducted and forced into sex slavery, I can understand why Elizabeth's parents would have thought this was the best case scenario, because at least it would have meant she was still alive. If this theory was true, then the possessive Asian male seen at the convenience stores with the woman resembling Elizabeth might have been her pimp. But there's a big issue which prevents me from believing that woman was Elizabeth. These sightings took place a very short time after she disappeared. The first sighting was only 6 days after Elizabeth was reported missing, and I have my doubts that a kidnapper would take his victim out into a very busy public place so soon after he abducted her. Like I just said, Lois Lee went into great detail about the methods pimps will use to control their victims, which involves keeping them confined and putting them through hell for a protracted period of time. By using tactics such as physical and sexual abuse, and depriving them of food, water, and light, the pimp creates, as Lee describes it, an invisible leash. It will reach the point where he will feel comfortable taking his victim out in public because he's confident that she won't dare try to escape. Well, could Elizabeth's kidnapper have reached this point after holding her in captivity for only 6 days? Granted, the first sighting took place in Waco, 85 miles from where Elizabeth disappeared, so maybe her captor might have thought it was okay to bring her out in public. But remember, the second sighting took place in Copperas Cove, the very same town she vanished from. By this point, Elizabeth's face is going to be plastered all over the area on missing persons flyers and in the newspaper, so it would be an enormous risk to bring her out into the open there. Not to mention that the sighting occurred only 2 weeks after Elizabeth went missing, so the timeline doesn't add up. It really doesn't make much sense for someone to kidnap Elizabeth in Copperas Cove, take her 85 miles away to Waco, and then bring her all the way back to the same place she was abducted from 2 weeks later. I guess it's not impossible that the scared-looking woman the witness saw in Garland 2 months later could have been Elizabeth, but there are so many missing persons cases which have demonstrated that eyewitnesses can be mistaken about who they see, so I'm inclined to believe that none of the 3 sightings were actually Elizabeth. All that being said, the 2 sightings of the woman and her possessive male companion are so similar that I'm willing to believe that they might have actually been the same people, who happened to stop at separate convenience stores in Waco and Copperas Cove. So I'd be very curious to know what the actual backstory for these 2 people might be. That's not to say the Asian man was a pimp and the woman was his prostitute, but it is possible they were a couple trapped in a very controlling relationship, and the man was an abusive jerk who always kept his spouse on a tight leash whenever they went out in public. The most bizarre clue in this case is the discovery of Elizabeth's purse in the property room of the Crockett County Sheriff's Department 4 years after she vanished. It's pretty strange that no one knows how it got there, but that's likely just the result of poor record-keeping from the department. Yet one detail which always stuck out at me was that all of Elizabeth's identification and her credit card were left in the purse, but some of her personal items, including her makeup and hairbrush, were missing. If you were to look at that from a certain angle, you could almost see this as evidence which supports the sex trafficking theory. Elizabeth's abductor gets rid of all of her identification to symbolize the stripping away of her former identity, but he lets her hold on to her makeup and hairbrush while keeping her in captivity. But I don't know, I'm inclined to go with the simplest explanation here, which is that Elizabeth was kidnapped and murdered by an opportunistic predator. When Elizabeth left her boyfriend's home, she was seen walking down Highway 190 when she was picked up by the college student who dropped her off at the 7-Eleven. In order to make it from Copperas Cove to Elizabeth's home in Lampasas, it would have required traveling west on Highway 190. And if you were to drive through Lampasas and continue west on that highway, you would eventually wind up in Ozona. So I think the most likely scenario is that a stranger offered Elizabeth a ride at or near the 7-Eleven and eventually murdered her somewhere before disposing of her body. If the perpetrator was someone who wasn't from the area and was just passing through, like a trucker or something, they might have continued going west on Highway 190, but by the time they reached Ozona, they noticed that Elizabeth's purse was still in the vehicle, so they decided to toss it. Someone then found the purse and turned it in at the nearest police station, but it was forgotten about for 4 years. Which is too bad, because if someone had looked at Elizabeth's ID and realized she was a missing person from 200 miles away, this case might have had a better chance of being solved. Sadly, I do not think that Elizabeth is alive, and she was probably murdered on the same night she disappeared. And even if she was abducted and forced into prostitution, the chances of her still being alive 30 years later are very slim. Articles which have been published about this case in recent years state that Elizabeth's parents are both getting up there in age and not in the best of health, so I can't even be certain if they're still alive right now. But if they are, it would be nice if they could still get closure. So if you have any information on the unsolved disappearance of Elizabeth Campbell, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thank you to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website. So if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.